Hello, and welcome to this talk about doing UX research or user experience research and ethnographic design for humanitarian technology. The projects that I reference in this talk are in the areas of peace building or peace education and crisis response or humanitarian response to natural and human-made disasters. There will be some specific stories and some general tips and advice for undertaking UX research or fieldwork in a country or community that isn't one of your own origin or of your own comfort. If you want access to these slides after this talk, you can access all of my different slides for all of my different talks on my notice page, which is https://noti.st/ErolFox, and that's Erol spelled E-R-I-O-L, Fox spelled F-O-X. So before we jump into the content of this talk, I have to cover some of the difficult topics that we will delve into through these content warnings. So the kinds of topics that we will talk about today are topics around violence specifically against women or women identifying people, the Manchester Arena bombing at the Ariana Grande concert, generally radicalisation of youth and terrorism, natural disasters and human-made disasters, colonialisation, racism, education and social status prejudice. And that's only a small part of some of the topics that we will be delving into. There may be other topics that are covered that are difficult for different individuals to hear. So I really encourage you to do what you need to do while you listen to this talk in order to stay safe and comfortable. Some slides within this talk will have no photos or copies, please. Please do not take photos or screenshots of these slides as the talk happens. Do not copy or redistribute them in any way. This is due to the fact that the people represented usually in these slides are people that have consented to being in the talk and in the slide content, but not widely distributed through any social means. I really appreciate that you recognize this and adhere to the no photos and no copies, please. So as I said, make sure that you're comfortable, make sure that you're ready, make sure that you do what you need to do to feel comfortable as we delve into some difficult topics. Pause the talk, take a break, come back to it, breathe deeply. And I really appreciate anyone listening and participating in this kind of topic. And I understand how difficult it can be to listen to these kinds of topics. So a little bit about me. I'm Erol. My pronouns are they, them. I've been working in digital product design and user experience for about 10 years now, a little bit longer, actually, I think, now that I think about it. And I've been doing community development work voluntarily and in some work capacities for around 7 years. And I've been in open source software for about 3 years, coming up to 4 years now. I am also recently a PhD student researching humanitarian open source software and how designers engage with and participate in those tools and those softwares. And I call myself a human rights-centered designer. So the context of a lot of this talk is from when I worked at Ushahidi. And Ushahidi is a Kenyan-based NGO that makes open source humanitarian technology for lots of different human rights cases and human rights needs. Ushahidi was an organization that was founded in 2007, 2008, and this was during the recent election turmoil that was happening in Kenya around the democratic elections there. And the founders found that they really wanted to be able to give a voice and give a platform to people in lots of different areas across Kenya in order to tell the other people, the other citizens around the country and globally, what was happening on the ground, what was happening when they tried to vote, what was happening when they were thinking about voting and coming to the decisions of how they wanted to vote, and really opening up that process through technology and giving the power to the people to speak their truth and speak their voice. Ushahidi's tools are most commonly used for crisis response, citizen empowerment, election monitoring, and citizen-led reporting around human rights abuses. But the examples on the screen at the moment, one of which is from the Nepal earthquakes, where the Ushahidi platform was used to aggregate reports from real people on the ground that were experiencing the earthquake as it happened and the after effects of the earthquake. And that information that the citizens gathered, the community groups and volunteers gathered, was then used by the Nepalese army in order to send helicopters for relief aid to the people that needed them the most. This really shows the power of citizen-led technology within a humanitarian context. The other example on the screen of one of Ushahidi's tools is called 10-4. This is a tool that was created after a terrorist attack in Nairobi on one of the shopping malls there, the Westgate Mall. And this was a situation where we, as an organization, as Ushahidi, knew that a number of the staff members could have and were in that mall as that attack was happening. And we didn't know whether they were okay. We were texting them, calling them, trying to find out whether they were safe. And when, after the attack finished and after the weekend was done, we came together as a organization, a technology organization, and thought there's a better way of communicating within crises than how we were able to do it over that awful weekend. And we came together and created a tool which was 10-4, which is a tool that aggregates all the different communication methods in crises in order to basically ensure that people are safe when something is happening. But I now do design at the Open Food Network. This is where I currently work, and I work on their open source technology. And their open source technology enables new and ethical supply chains where communities can bring together producers to create virtual farmers markets and build resilient local food economies. So access to food is a human right, and the process to make food more open and sustainable and part of the commons is a goal that I personally strongly adhere to, and one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be working at the Open Food Network on their design work and processes. The Open Food Network doesn't just maintain and support an open source software platform that allows the producers globally to sell their produce and to for people to buy from them, but it also really enables and nourishes this global community focused on learning, understanding, and improving how we as humans consume and care for the planet through food and produce. So I'm always staying within these human rights contexts, within these for good contexts, and within this open source software context with the places that I do my design work in. So digging into the real meat of this talk, or the real main part of this talk, one of the first things that I'd like to talk about is different terms that you may have heard of. So terms like developing countries or the global south. And this is particularly well known if you engage with any kind of humanitarian work or third sector work or charity work. Typically, these are names and labels for other places, and the different kinds of names and labels that are used are often many and vast and changing, and sometimes confusing as to what they specifically reference. The main reason that I wanted to draw attention to this language of developing countries or the global south is because there is no perfect language here. Our language and our different words for how we categorize and collect different communities and different people in different countries is by no means perfect, by very few means even serviceable. And typically when I will talk about the work that I've done, I will refer specifically to a country, if that is the place that some work has been done, or I may generally refer to developing countries or the global south. More and more, I'm trying to remove this kind of language from my vocabulary and use language such as the underrepresented majority or the underserved majorities, or the different or just specifically the different communities that I work with and naming them. Please forgive me though if I slip back into old habits and use some of this problematic language. It's still very ingrained within the humanitarian industry and often can be something that we slip back into at times. So to go into the different projects, which I will be talking about in detail, the two projects around peace building and crisis response. The first that I'll reference is called Izuku. And Izuku, which means Fountain of Peace in Kenya, Rwanda, which is one of Rwanda's national languages. And Izuku Fountain of Peace is a EU-funded consortium project, which was undertaken by universities, nonprofits, and companies. It finished at the end of 2020. And the organizations involved in the Izuku project were King's College London, the University of Makerere, Dotsoft, Leiden University, the Aegis Trust, and Kigali Collaborative Research Centre, alongside Ushahidi and myself as a member of Ushahidi staff at the time. And Izuku's aim as a project was to explore the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya over the period of 3 years. And you can find out more information at the URL, which is izuku.eu. And Izuku is spelled I-S-O-O-K-O. The second project that I'll talk about is called Dispatcher. And this was a shorter minimum viable product tech project that was done over the period of 6 months at Ushahidi through some funding that we received from the Rockefeller Foundation, or the Rockefeller Funding Project. And Dispatcher's aim was to discover whether technology could help people create and maintain resilience in times of crisis. And during those times of crisis, what kind of technology aids and helps people rather than overwhelms them? And we were really looking at something which we sometimes would refer to as community cohesion, and how people globally help each other in response to crises. And that there was this linked idea between community cohesion and resilience in both an individual way and also a group or community way. And you can think of individuals as part of small community groups, but then also as part of larger global communities and global groups as well. You can find out more about Dispatcher on a URL which is on screen, a shortened URL which is on screen at the moment, which is a bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/ush-dispatcher. Dispatcher is spelled D-I-S-P-A-T-C-H-E-R. So, one of the first questions that you might be thinking of as I talk about these different projects that we are going to delve into the UX research and ethnographic research of from a technological and design perspective is, so why Rwanda and Kenya? So it might feel like a given to be doing humanitarian work in these places. It's kind of reasonably understandable that these are the kinds of places that you typically hear of that receive humanitarian aid and humanitarian work. But why I really want to spend one of the first sections of this talk just better understanding this is because it's so important to understand and explore why you're doing work in a specific location. So within the context of Izuku and Dispatcher, Rwanda's history with genocide led to a number of different social policies and projects that worked on peace building and peace education. And Kenya's history of tribal and political conflict allowed really deep exploration into crisis. But when you're looking at where to conduct your research and what kind of places you would like to be doing your user experience research and your ethnographic design research in, you should really be thinking about asking yourself these questions. Why is this the country or city or community that I really want to investigate this problem in? And what can I learn from this community, this country, this city, that I might find more difficult or not as relevant in my country of residence? And what unique problems am I committing to solve by doing my research here? So even if you are very likely to be conducting research in various countries, in your country of origin, or if you have a higher decision that has kind of been pretty much made to be that you're doing your research in a specific country, it's still incredibly good practice to ask yourself these questions. So even if you're the kind of designer, the kind of technologist, the kind of person working on technology tools that actually doesn't often think outside of your country of origin, perhaps you're based in the US, the UK, another country in Europe, and you very rarely do work or research outside of your country of origin, i.e., let's go with the UK as an example. Asking yourself these questions still about the UK and the UK's context is such good practice for when you could be then thinking about doing UX research and ethnographic work in other countries that are not your country of origin. So moving into this topic that I briefly touched on in the last slide around restrictions around where you might be doing your work. So even though Rwanda and Kenya were legitimately the best places to conduct these projects, these pieces of work, the grant funding that we were working with at the time on these projects often stipulates in that proposal phase, so that initial phase where you're defining what you would like to explore, what you'd like to build, what kind of technologies you'll be investigating, maybe even what communities you'll be engaging with. And often in this proposal stage is where there's that stipulation that we're going to do these research, or this research should happen here. And most humanitarian work is funded through grants, even the technology work, unless you're looking at other funding models. And so that that restriction or that rigidness around where you do your work is often it often happens through this kind of grant proposal stage. And it really does, from a design practice kind of point of view, restrict the opportunity to discover other locations where this research could be done, and could those locations and those countries and those communities which could benefit from this research as well, and where you could learn lots of new things that impact how you build your tools. And that is restricted unless you can find further funding or maybe another partner organization in this other location that you're considering. But what I would find myself doing, curiously enough, when I'm working on when I was specifically working on these two projects, but many other projects that I've worked on that have a research element to them, I would find myself doing research on multiple different projects continuously as I visited different places for different kinds of projects. And really that had a lot of relevance. It had a lot of benefits to the general learning that I was able to do around the projects that I was investigating from a design perspective. And for example, even though these two projects were primarily based across East African countries, Rwanda and Kenya and Uganda, For example, I did like what I would call satellite research for Izuku when I specifically visited Kazakhstan and Tunisia, and when I visited Romania as well. And I did lots of different crisis-related research actually at home here in the UK and across the US and Australia through some of my other project connections. So one of the things that is a really interesting juxtaposition is the restriction from a sort of grant proposal, project proposal, restrictive point of view, but then actually what you do in practice often is a little bit more flexible, or you can build in that flexibility around the restrictions. And another tricky thing when we're talking about restrictions around this kind of work is with funded humanitarian work is when academia is involved, and often academia or university institutions are involved in these kinds of research pieces. And the specific restriction that we found within the Izuku project, which ended up being a little bit more flexible than we initially understood, was the methodologies that you are using within these projects. So as design practitioners or as technological practitioners, we often use the methods, the activities, all the different ways all the different tools in our toolbox that give us the pathways to the kinds of results that we want to investigate, or the kinds of paths that we want to investigate to access those results that we would find out through that path. And we are interested in exploring what gets us to those key insights for better technology. Whereas with academia, knowing this myself now being a PhD student, it's also about testing the methodological relevancy of a specific method, as well as putting it into practice. So design academics and the practitioners notably have these different needs from the projects that they're engaging with and the different kinds of research that you do. And I have, in my time and on these specific projects as well with Izuku and Dispatcher, had many heated but kind debates with academic partners about the essential flexibility needed within the methodologies that we are presented with. If you're interested specifically in the methodologies that we used on some of these projects, the one that we used for Izuku is something called Living Labs. And we applied this very much and very accurately, without many needs for flexibility and adaptation, to the work that we did with the public. So general public, members of the public, general communities of people that aren't necessarily working in key areas that we were that we wanted to separate and do different approaches to. And the nice thing about Living Labs as a methodology is it sits really closely with participatory design approaches, where you really involve stakeholders in the process of creating solutions. And it sits very closely with open source as well, which was something that Ishihide, as a organization participating in this project, was really dedicated to as well. But with Dispatcher, with the other project, the crisis project we were working on, we didn't actually have academia involved in that project through there was no academic partner that we were working with. And therefore we were able to play with the different kinds of methodologies, the different kind of processes that we used and how we approached our research. There was a lot more flexibility involved within that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we specifically worked with some of the different key stakeholders within the Izuku project now. So how we actually started to apply the methodologies, the research, and what we actually did with people around this UX research for these humanitarian tools. So when we were looking at how to engage others in our research, specifically this topic of a civil society organization, or I might refer to them as CSOs from now on, they were an integral stakeholder of the peace education and peace building, and they were a key group that we wanted to include within the Izuku project and the Izuku research that we had. So we were really they were a really key stakeholder, and we were really clear early on about how we wanted to include the CSOs. But from previous experience, a team member who worked on the programs side of things, the programmatic research, the programmatic grant side of things, flagged that CSOs will have very different needs and expectations than the general public that we were working with. And we really needed to offer the CSOs more value beyond simple sort of participation in workshops and activities. And what we really discovered, and what we workshopped internally with the delivery team, was how we could give them, the civil society organizations, deeper insight into how they do their own work with the communities that they were working with, which were the same as the public that we were working with within the Izuku project. This was a key element to how to best include civil society organizations within the Izuku research work. And to briefly describe what we did with each group, for the public, we were required to do some activities with all the different groups. So we still kept some of these activities that we were required to from this sort of restrictive methodological academia side of things that I briefly talked about. But we did decide to omit one activity through lots of different discussions, and it was decided that we would not include this activity in order to better serve the other activities that are on the screen at the moment, so that we could make these ones more engaging and relevant. So with the public, we did user journeys, we created personas, we did something called stakeholder mapping, and then we really focused on an element of the process, which was rapid prototyping with different kinds of paper prototypes, ideas, sketches, storyboards, and then sometimes technology, depending on how the different members of the public wanted to approach rapid prototyping. But with the CSOs, as I said earlier, we were really focused on sharing what we'd learned from the public, because we wanted to offer them that insight into the work that they were doing. So the first thing that one of the first things that we wanted to do with the CSOs was defining what the understanding of peace and peace building was across all the different civil society organizations that had gathered for our research work. But then we wanted them to better understand what had happened within our public workshops. So we spent a long time with them in the sessions that we built for the CSOs about how to understand the material that had come out of the public workshops, and understanding the thoughts of the public and how it related to the work that they were currently doing. So that was looking at the user journeys and personas and rapid prototypes of the previous public research and the public work. So we spent this whole morning taking them through the different public pieces of work, the public user journeys and personas, and they really connected to the people that they served. And this enabled them to build empathy and critically analyze what they were currently doing in their peace building activities, to then learn from some of the tech tool demos that we then offered them, and do something what is called impact mapping of the different services that they have, and then build in the rapid prototyping from the public sessions into the civil society organization sessions. So it was quite a busy day for the civil society organizations, and it was a really well enjoyed day, as well as hugely informative for them and us through the research. And the part that I want to say to wrap up this section around how we approach this specific part of the research for Izuku is really about, even though we have some restrictions, academic boundaries, and different kinds of things that we really needed to consider within the research that we were doing, the things that we were conducting, the engagements that we were doing, was that we very early on built in the understanding across the delivery team, the value of flexibility within different activities. And actually, this is best described by the fact that we did a persona building activity. But with the first group of public, and we did two days with two different groups of public groups. On the first day, we observed a certain behavior around building personas that we observed and just thought this isn't quite working for the people that are engaging with this activity. And so on the second day with the public, we spent the previous night reworking that activity to make it much more accessible to the people that were coming along on the second day. And it changed from a long form writing exercise with personas to something that was much more engaging. It was an interview experience with 2 different people or 3 different people actually having a conversation about persona type characteristics. And it really enabled people to connect more deeply with the ideas of building personas and why you would do that, and connect more to the human element of personas, rather than essentially asking people to write a very long piece of paper of different kinds of demographic information. And the flexibility was what allowed us to change that and adapt that exercise. Generally, there is something which we learned very early on in these 2 projects, actually, Izuku and Dispatcher, especially when we were working with the public, that I honestly hadn't anticipated, that when you're working with populations that have been historically used to receiving humanitarian aid, or used to having a charitable or governmental civil society organization influence on the activities that they do within their daily lives, within the communities they participate in, these public members of the research that you would intend to do are what I call very aid language or non-profit language proficient. And they use certain language and certain phrases with the researchers that enter, especially if you're very visibly not from that country, or it's clear that you're a visiting researcher. And what I expect this language was doing is it was an effort to appear connected to the work that you're doing, perhaps an effort to appear fundable or to appear as more competent, when really what we wanted was, people's very natural, very uninfluenced and uninformed experiences. And even though the aid proficient language was part of their experience, you just have to be very careful and very understanding that when you go into these contexts, when you go into these communities to do your research, you may come up against this very non-profit language proficiency, and it just takes that little bit of extra time and a lot of empathy and a lot of work to kind of break out of that cycle of wanting to give a certain kind of language back to the researchers that they think is expected, the public think is expected of them. So we're going to get into a really tricky section of the presentation now, but it's a really interesting section of the presentation as well. It's strangely one of the parts of this talk that I enjoy. It's a weird word to say, but it's one of the ones that I think is the most interesting, the least talked about in a lot of ways, but it can be quite difficult. And what we're going to talk about now briefly is working with trauma. And as a researcher, when you're confronted by or confronted with subjects around traumatized experiences, or people's individual trauma, or even your own trauma. And I had anticipated this when I was planning the research for both Izuku and Dispatcher, but not to the extent of which I individually experienced it. So I hope that the next few slides helps you anticipate your projects even more than what I was able to with these 2 projects. So this is on screen right now is a group of women, arms raised in a very energetic and strong position. This was a group that we worked with on the Izuku and Dispatcher projects, and they're called Polycom Women, and you can find them on Facebook, which is facebook.com/Polycom Development Project. Polycom spelled Polycom, then Development Project, all one word. So the Polycom women are a fantastic group of women across generations, across backgrounds, absolutely dedicated to the variety and varied breadth of peace building in a specific area of central Nairobi called Kibera, which is an informal settlement, or a slum, if you know that is language that you're more familiar with. And Kibera is a area which has a lot of different kinds of challenges, a lot of different kinds of problems, specifically a lot of political, social, and economic problems, along with the peace and kind of peace building and violence that the peace building responds to. And specifically what I kind of want to talk about is an instance when we were working with Polycom women around the workshops that we were having, and the times that I was confronted with my own personal experience and relationship with traumatic activities, as well as other people's trauma in a conversational research context. To give you just an understanding of what one of Polycom's activities for peace building is they will do things like, as a group, they will kind of anticipate when civil unrest is going to happen in their local area, usually through political news or different things that they know are happening. And they will go to the prevalent areas of where youths, typically young people or unemployed people, will potentially be starting violent activities or be pushed into violent activities for what the many complex reasons that might be. And they will go to these places and do things, these central locations like town squares and parks and different kinds of shopping market areas. And they will play football in the streets very badly, even though they can play football incredibly well by now. But they will play football badly on purpose so that the young people that are pushed into violent activities will, rather than engage in these violent activities, come and correctly show these women how to play football better. And the women can then engage them around conversations to do with peace building and anti-violence and political information and things like that. So these are the kinds of activities that the Polycom women do, alongside lots of different peaceful protest activities, healthcare, and community activities. But the specific example that I wanted to give was that during the journey mapping exercise that we had for the Izuku project, the attendees of the workshop were asked to map a crisis, an incident that they'd experienced. And many of these women were talking about incidents where they'd been kidnapped, or where they'd been robbed, or where they'd witnessed gender-based violence or tribal violence or political violence. And one of the women spoke in great detail about a peaceful protest activity that ended in injury from stones being thrown at them for being too outspoken. And she described this as in a sort of casual and almost joking manner at the time in the conversation I was having with her, because it was such a, at the time, an ordinary experience. They'd experienced many of these kinds of violent incidents where they'd been harmed trying to do the work that they do. And myself as a researcher at the time this was one of the first times that I'd been confronted with a act of violence, or an incident that had happened in the past to somebody I was working on this research with. And I hadn't previously, when planning the research, really anticipated what I would do in that case of hearing this detailed account of what had happened to this person and how to best care for those participants. And just to show some examples of some of the other journey maps that people had created and the kind of content on them, to give you an understanding of the breadth of what was mapped. We have a user journey map which is separated into before, during, and after, which is around an incident or a crisis that we ask the participants to map. And the kinds of, when we zoom in, the kinds of details that are on this map are things like war, high food prices, sounds of bullets, and lots of other kinds of details of the kinds of really difficult, horrific, often difficult to relate to unless you have had similar experiences yourself. Hard to understand what this really means to an individual to write this down on a piece of paper for a research activity. And even though there were many things, as I said, that I was relatively unprepared for in the moment kind of research conversations, there was a number of things that we were able to prepare for. And the part of this part of the talk is really about how you can begin to prepare for these kinds of traumatic conversations and traumatic content, essentially, in your research. And one of the things that we were able to do, we were able to anticipate and plan for, was because we paid really close attention to the idea of trauma within peace building, and through the conversations we had with the internal team, the academic partners, the Aegis Trust that do work around the Kigali Memorial Center in Rwanda to pay respect to and document the genocide that happened there. We were able to really think about how we would deal with the traumatic topics that would come up. And this is one example of my own exploration into an experience of a very difficult crisis. That was the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, the bombing that happened there. And I used this as an example, and I worked with this as my own content to really explore the idea of trauma within technology and what we were asking our research participants to do. And this was used as an example within the workshops. So to wrap up this section around trauma, or to attempt to wrap up this section around trauma, one of the things that I often ask the people listening to this section to do, if you feel able to, if you feel comfortable and safe to explore this kind of topic, is to really think of a deeply upsetting event in your own life and begin to journey map that event. You can find some resources online for journey mapping. I can provide some links. There's links in the slides when you can get access to the slides as well. But the idea is to think about this upsetting event. And one of the critical things to think about is everyone has a different upsetting events that happen throughout their life. There is no good or bad kind of level of upsetting to map. It's about your own personal experience with an upsetting event. It's not about the extremity of an upsetting event to journey map. It's about you working with the things that are hard for you to better understand what you're asking participants to do, if you indeed ask participants to work with this kind of content themselves. So if you can, think about an event that happened, begin to journey map and see what comes up for you, see what it raises for you, and really interrogate how you would feel to hand that over to a researcher to use within a project, within a technology tool that they might build, and potentially thinking about how that can be commodified and how that is turned into insight and artifacts. Think about how those words make you feel when you're working with this when you're working with this topic. There are a few other things that we did in order to make sure that we did that work ethically. Some of them are on screen at the moment. So we went through the same processes ourselves. We built compassionate connection through our own examples, but also very logistically relevant things, which were attendees were notified pre-workshop of subject matter. There was psychological support on site, confidentiality, and everyone was supported post-workshop, including the researchers. So moving on slightly from traumatic subject matter, but only taking really a side step really, is about how, as a researcher, surprising topics can crop up and how you work with your reaction and your own material to do with those topics. So it might not be traumatic topics that come up, but it might be difficult topics that elicit an emotional reaction from yourself. And I'm going to give this example of when I was doing work with Dispatcher around some very seemingly innocuous or seemingly simple parts of a UI experience around car sharing. And getting lifts from people in the local community area in order to build this kind of community resilience idea that I talked about at the beginning. But as I was talking to the participant that is pictured on screen at the moment, we started talking about things like car ride sharing and access to vehicles and cars and the social status and privilege that cars represent and owning a car represents within some communities within Kenya and Nairobi. And that conversation then went into the differences of UK or Western poverty. And I say UK because I'm from the UK and I talk to my participants and they know I'm from the UK. And the difference between the UK Western poverty and Kenyan poverty, and class systems that are different, very different in very different places. And we had this really in-depth, surprising to me, conversation from something that I wasn't necessarily expecting from a research content point of view, but how that experience, that conversation about poverty and social class systems around cars helped me to work on how I responded to difficult topics in subsequent interviews and the subsequent research projects. So many subjects can arise. I think the main thing on this part is that the more that you can do your own work into your own country of origin's history, the relation that your country might have with the country that you're doing work in, and the topics that can arise at any point, really. And because I'm white and I'm from the UK and I have a British accent, there is an inherent historical context around the colonialization when I am doing research work in countries that are specifically former colonies of the UK. And the best way that I have learned to approach this is absolute and complete honesty and transparency about what I know, what I don't know enough about, and the willingness to have conversations about topics with my participants should they want to as well. Not necessarily raising it myself, there's an power imbalance there, but being respectful and understanding why that conversation might need to happen within the context of your research. And it's never time wasted learning about the history, the culture, and the communities of where you are going to do your UX user experience research and where you're going to be taking your technology products. One of the ways that you can prepare for this is simulating these things through role play before you get into that participant experience. So internally within your teams and with safe communities that you feel safe in, have these conversations as much as you possibly can. Some of the ways which I like to try and engage with participants as well, specifically participants that I don't necessarily share a very healthy cultural background with, either through colonialization topics or just simply being from somewhere else, but I want to build that connection in order to learn more about how I can improve what I'm trying to work on from a technology point of view. Is there are some things to just be aware of, which is what your race and ethnicity is, and your race and ethnicity in relation to the person that you're doing your work with, what your perceived gender or sex is, and that's not necessarily what you identify as, it's what perhaps you are perceived as, and your own thoughts around that, and just understanding that conversation might arise. Your social status, or again, your perceived social status, and your interest in circumstances, and your education level as well. There is something which I think is generally a fairly universal value, which is usually positively shared among cultures, which is typically around food. Although that being said, I have had conversations with people around different food-related trauma topics. So I do think that no matter what your topic is around your research or around your technology tool, be aware that even the simplest of topics can elicit some difficult conversations, for sure. So the more that you know, the more that you practice, the better you'll be prepared. I'm going to really briefly cover this next section because even from my own point of view, there isn't a lot of clarity with the different kinds of approaches that you can take. And I've really, with this kind of research, and I've really briefly covered what I think these two terms on the screen mean at the moment. So this might feel a bit unsatisfactory for some people that want more in depth about these two terms that I've got up on screen at the moment, which is deep ethnographic and versus dip in, dip out researcher. And I have an inclination towards deep ethnographic, just purely from a personal preference point of view and the kind of community work that I've done previously. So from my perspective, deep ethnographic is where, like on screen at the moment, I've got an example photograph of a previous colleague sat around a table with community members in Kathmandu in Nepal. And this is a person that really helped me understand deep ethnographic and anthropological approaches to design research, because he spent months in this community in Nepal working on this research and tech project. And when he talked about this project that he worked on, it made me really think of some of the work that I did on screen at the moment, some of my work with Team Rubicon UK, now known as React UK, and the SARAID, which is the Urban Search and Rescue Community Resilience Team in the UK here. There's two pictures of me doing work, various different community work with those two organizations. And deep ethnographic to me really is encapsulated by this kind of work. This is where I've almost meshed my personal work with these organizations that is also relevant to my research and my design and my technology research. So I'm not only participating in the activities of the groups that I am researching with, but as I'm doing those activities in a genuine, I am participating and part of you kind of way, I'm also learning from them. So I'm learning and doing the research alongside the actual activities. And often deep ethnographic for me can become really tricky. It could be called, some bias. There could be some bias involved there. There can definitely be a very difficult blending of your role within those communities. But there's also a lot of benefits to doing this approach, like in the scope of what you'll learn and the breadth of what you'll learn beyond a very isolated incident of research, which is what I understand dip in, dip out research as. And with Izuku and Dispatcher, we actually did more of the dip in, dip out with Izuku than we did with Dispatcher. Or personally, I did more dip in, dip out with Izuku than I did do with Dispatcher. Dispatcher was a lot longer involved ethnographic work for me, but still we mixed these methods quite a lot. And there was two key researchers on each project, and we both kind of leaned towards one different style. But dip in, dip out is kind of what we understand as general kind of research. You recruit people for very specific research needs. You do that research conversation or activity with them, and then typically you'd never see or hear from them again unless you have follow-up, very specific boundaried research activities. And this was covered in some of the structured and unstructured interviews that we did for Dispatcher, but also the workshops that we did in Izuku, but mixed personally with some of the deeper ethnographic stuff that I was doing for Dispatcher around being involved in these crisis organizations. So as we come to wrap up, there's a number of different things that I could carry on with, but there are some really key safety things that I want you to understand before you think about how to do your own research. So I'm going to quick fire some of these. So safety is so important, and staying healthy is so important as well. So things to do with safety are things like taking burner phones and extra devices, doing interviews in pairs and threes, and doing any activities in pairs and threes, making sure you choose public or very safe areas to conduct interviews and vet those areas beforehand, scope them out before. Do this for yourself, but also for your participants. They need to feel safe as well, and they need to know that they're safe. Make sure a participant can get to a location within their financial means, and make sure that you compensate them, and also understand the cultural differences with locations and when to meet and how to meet, as well as the very different understanding of what is acceptable lateness to an appointment and what is not across different cultural communities. Make sure that you look into local police, hospital structures and different sort of safety policies. And I would recommend that you always build a document and simulate what you would do in these circumstances. Something that's very specific to me is I always look at a country's LGBTQ+ laws and criminalizations before I head to a country, and make sure that my organization or research partners know what that is as well. And investigate local things that might be happening at the time that you're doing research. Like there might be specific kinds of muggings that might happen certain places and how they might happen. It's always good to do that extra bit of research and be in the know rather than not. Make sure you take your vaccinations and take lots of medication. I get sick relatively frequently on different research trips, so it's always good to take extra meds. So there's a number of other things that I'm going to recommend that you do and practice when you're able to go on vacation again. Doing lots of community research online is great. Taking lots of photos is also great, as long as you have permission. Make sure you have permission. And one thing that I would always recommend you do is try and have conversations with cab drivers and taxi drivers, as long as you feel safe and as long as it's about a topic that you are happy to talk about that might, again, get difficult. There's so many great resources out there to start learning about how to do this kind of work. So you don't need to plan your first field research trip to do humanitarian UX and design just yet, but you can learn from great reports like the Leaving No One Behind, the lessons from the Kerala disasters, Safe Sisters, which is digital security challenges faced by women human rights defenders, and the Human Rights Big Data and Technology Project, which are links that will be provided in the slides that you can get access to. Going to conferences and events, you can learn so much from events like RightsCon, MozFest, Tech for Good events, Peace Tech Lab events, and the Internet Freedom Festival. These are great places to learn from and meet people from communities and to do work with. And other communities like the Human Rights Centered Design community, which you can find at https://hrcd.pubpub.org. That's the Human Rights Centered Design community. Lots of cool conversations being had in that community around the intersection of design and human rights. My two last resources slides are lots of great organizational links like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Access Now, Code for America, the Axis Tools, Design Justice Network, and the Advocacy Assembly are all great places to find different methodologies, different activities to do with people when you're ready to do your UX research and with human rights work. And there are so many great books out there. This is just a sample of books, which on the screen at the moment is Designing When Everyone Designs by Ezio Manzini, Digital Economies at Global Margins by Mark Graham, Digital Witness by Deborah Koenig and Murray, Digital Democracy Analog Politics by Nanjala Nyabola, and Civic Technologist Practice Guide by Sid Harrell. These are fantastic books that I've very much enjoyed reading and learning about humanitarian tech from. My final slide is to say thank you for listening, and you can find me various different places on the internet at Eriol Does Design, across Twitter, across LinkedIn, at Eriol Fox, on GitHub and on Medium. Thank you very much for listening.